exam, it's a lot to absorb. Then we're going to go to the valves of the heart. So each time blood leaves a chamber of the heart, it's going to go through a valve to prevent it flowing back into that chamber. So when blood leaves the atria, they're going to go through the atrioventricular valves, as they're called, and into the ventricles. Then when the ventricle squeezes, that valve's going to close so that all the blood will go to up here. So on the right-hand side, if you look at the atrioventricular valve, and here it is, it's quite a showy looking valve with all those strings attached, it's got 3 flaps. As you can see in there that valve has 3 valve flaps. And so that is the tricuspid valve on that side with its 3 flaps. On this one, it's a little hard to see and you have to use a bit of imagination, but actually it's just 2 flaps, rather bigger, one on each side, kind of like in the same position as my hands are. And so that's the bicuspid valve, and a little hard to see it. So tricuspid valve is probably more obvious that it has 3, or maybe not even. So the right AV valve is called the tricuspid valve. The left is called the bicuspid valve, and it's also called, very commonly in sort of heart surgery circles, called the mitral valve. A mitre is a hat that a bishop wears. It has kind of a split down the middle, so it ends up looking like this. And somebody at some point thought it looked fancifully kind of like a bishop's mitre, so mitral valve, that's what that means. So those are the 2 valves that are going to prevent backflow into the atria. Once the atria have given their blood to the ventricles, and the ventricles squeeze, that's going to close off. Blood will flow through here. But then we also need blood. We also need to prevent blood flowing back into the ventricles, because when they squeeze, sure, it's going to push out. What happens when they start to relax and expand again? They're going to create suction, and blood is going to get drawn back potentially. Well, we don't want that to happen, so we've got to have little pocket valves in the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. The aorta one's barely shown, but you can see the pulmonary trunk one. And so they're much less spectacular because they're just filling a narrow opening as opposed to a big opening between 2 chambers. So, but if I try to catch one of these little flaps, there, you can see. So these are much more like the valves that are in vein. So if you look down there where I'm wiggling this thing, you can see it's got a little flap, what looks like a little flap of skin. And you can get a heart and see it for yourselves. But there you go. Maybe that's a bigger one over on this. Okay, there. Now there, I've kind of pushed it into the opening. So there you can see it. You can see it there. So there it is. So that would be the pulmonary valve, because it's on the pulmonary side, or pulmonary semilunar valve, if we want to give it. Collectively, they're called the semilunar valves. But this is generally called the pulmonary valve. And the other one, so hard to see that I'm obviously not going to be able to pin it, although I guess I can kind of see it down there, but pretty hard to see, is the aortic valve. There's one in the aorta too that looks just like that. So those are the valves, and knowing the valves, because it could ask, what valve is this? And it would stick the pin on one of the valves, and then you'd have to say. And in here you can kind of see the valve. And probably somewhere, okay, like here, this is showing a valve entrance. So this is, since it's coming from the left ventricle, this must be the beginning of the aorta, so it must be the aorta. All right, so, but this isn't going to be used at all. Just this heart is going to be used for the practical. When we do the final, there'll be a couple of questions from the human model. Other heart structures, the ligamentum arteriosum is this connective tissue that holds the 2 major arteries together, the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. They're both under pressure, like 2 hose pipes. They kind of would flap around a lot more if they weren't held together. The original purpose of this was to create a bypass. In fetal circulation. You don't really need to go to the air, to go to the lungs for oxygen, because the fetus isn't breathing air. So it's a way to bypass the pulmonary area altogether. The fossa ovale, but now after we're born, it simply acts as a way to hold those two arteries together. So it's this connective tissue, basically, here between it, like that. The fossa ovalis is, if you look under my finger here, you see this like a little place where there's a window of very thin tissue, and that seems like kind of strange that the wall of the heart between the two atria would be so thin in that area. Almost like a hole. Well, it was a hole, and that also is from fetal circulation. When the blood arriving in the right-hand side of the heart, it's not going to get any oxygen from the lungs, so it might as well skip over to the left side and go about its business. So that is the fossa ovalis. That would be a hole in the fetal pig. That would be the foramen ovale, and then the hole closes up. If it doesn't close up properly, and there's a little place where it's not closed, then that's what is meant by a hole in the heart when you're born. So the interatrial septum is, a septum goes down the middle between two chambers, like down the middle of your nose. So here's the interatrial septum here, but if it indicates the fossa ovalis, you should put that. The auricles I already talked about. The pectinate muscles, if you look inside the auricle, you can kind of see some wrinkling in there. You can almost see it from the outside. But it's kind of wrinkled looking. The muscles are arranged in a wrinkly kind of way, which is true of most organs that are going to be asked to stretch and go back, like the bladder, the stomach, pretty much anything like that, because if it's going to stretch, it's going to tear the lining unless there's a lot of wrinkling when it's closed up, and then it unfolds to smooth, and then it can go back like that. Now, like when you take off your underwear, the old, fruit of the loom wrinkles up and then stretches back out again when you put it. Similar idea, the fruit of the loom theory of the. So those are little pectinate muscles. Again, pretty hard to get a pin in there and try to pin them without. I mean, what would I say? What are these muscles? Because I mean, it would look like I was asking for the auricle, so I more likely would just ask for it on the outside if I was asking for that. So the ventricle has the interventricular septum. So here on the inside, this structure would be the interventricular septum. But there's a lot of other things going on in here. There's the papillary muscles and the chordae tendineae. So the chordae tendineae are these, let's use this little pen. The chordae tendineae are these strings here, the heart strings, so to speak. The papillary muscles are the little lumps of flesh that they attach to. So right here, this is a papillary muscle, because we can see there's a lot of strings attached to it. So it's not like the rest of the wall of the heart. And there's probably a couple of other examples over on this side too. But that would be an example of a papillary muscle. So, and then the chordae tendineae are the strings themselves. So you can see that that's different from just these lumps over here, which are not attached to the strings. These lumps over here are the trabeculae carnae. And so if I wanted to do that, I would ask for it way up here. They're kind of ridge-like strands of muscle, and that again is to allow it to stretch and recoil without tearing the lining. So the papillary muscles and chordae tendineae are, okay, so here's the atrium, here's the ventricle, and okay, so here's the say it's the left and right ventricle which we were looking at. So this would be the pulmonary trunk. It's got its own little valve. So the ventricle squeezes, and the tricuspid valve, or right atrioventricular valve, was open, letting blood flow in. The ventricle squeezes, and it's going to close up. Hopefully it'll close up like that. It's got all these strings that are attached here, and there's a papillary muscle. There's strings on that one, and another papillary muscle. So the purpose of the papillary muscle and the chordae tendineae is not to open the valve, because if the blood comes in, it's going to flow in pretty easily. The purpose of it is to make sure the valve doesn't prolapse, as it's called, doesn't flow open the other way, like a swing door. Because once the ventricle's squeezing, there's a lot of pressure on that valve to fly up, and these guys are like holding it back to make sure it stops and doesn't do that. Otherwise, it would defeat its own purpose. So that is the real reason behind the papillary muscles and the chordae tendineae, and they're fairly obviously important in the valve function in that way. Last thing to look at is the moderator band. I didn't see a good one in there, and here it is. Very unimportant. I'll make sure it's not on the practical, but it is a way of identifying the left from the right. Most people don't have one. Pigs have them. When we have the little sheep hearts, they have them too. So I guess some animals have them. Some people do have them, but they're kind of a less common thing to even have at all. I don't think it's even mentioned in the book anywhere. So what it does, the purpose of it is to allow when the two ventricles are squeezing, the left ventricle is so dominant, the poor right ventricle is trying to hang on to squeeze in sync with it, and that helps to add some stability. But like I said, right. So the question about in the report about how could you tell from the moderator band which ventricle you're in, you could say, well, because the left ventricle doesn't have one or need one. Only the right ventricle has it. But other than that, it's really, I will not ask the moderator.